My days at the Whitmore Manor began early, before the sun had a chance to stretch its golden fingers across the rolling hills that surrounded the estate. At 72, my life had settled into a rhythm that I found both comforting and isolating, a world of dusting chandeliers, polishing silver, and scrubbing floors that never truly seemed to need it. The manor was a grand place, the kind of house that seemed more like a monument than a home. But for me, it was just work. Steady work. The Whitmores were wealthy in a way I'd never known. Their lives seemed to float on a layer of quiet opulence, untouched by the struggles I'd faced in my years. Mr. Whitmore was a businessman, rarely home except for late nights and weekends. Mrs. Whitmore, young, beautiful, and effortlessly elegant, was a woman who moved through life as though it were a stage. She had a way of making her presence known without trying, her laughter echoing through the halls, her perfume lingering long after she'd left a room. I'd only been at the manor for a few months, having taken the job after my last one, a cleaning position at a small office, had ended. I hadn't wanted to take on something so grand, so close to the lives of people who felt worlds apart from me. But work was work, and I needed the money to keep my small apartment in town. So, I swallowed my nerves and accepted. At first, I did everything I could to stay invisible, to blend into the background. That was the unspoken rule of our work as cleaners. We were there to make things perfect, not to be seen. And I was good at it. I'd spent my life perfecting the art of being unnoticed, of folding myself into the edges of other people's lives. But there was something about Mrs. Whitmore that made it difficult to stay detached. She was kind in a way I hadn't expected, offering a warm smile when we passed in the hall, asking after my health when she caught me polishing the banister. It was a small kindness, but it meant more than I wanted to admit. Most of the people I worked for didn't look at me twice. The first time I felt the stirring of familiarity, I dismissed it. It was a fleeting moment. She had passed me in the dining room, her voice lilting as she spoke to one of the staff. Something about the way she laughed, the way she tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, had made my chest tighten. For a second, I thought I knew her. But that was impossible. I went back to my work, scrubbing at a stubborn spot on the polished wood floor, shaking off the feeling. My imagination had a way of playing tricks on me, especially when I was tired. Besides, I had learned long ago that the past was best left alone. Still, the moments kept coming. A glimpse of her profile as she leaned against the balcony railing. The sound of her voice drifting down the hall, a certain cadence that felt like a song I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was silly, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that there was something familiar about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't until I saw her in the garden one afternoon, crouched by the rose bushes, that the feeling became impossible to ignore. She was humming softly, a tune I hadn't heard in decades, but recognized instantly. It was the lullaby I used to sing to my daughter, Emily, when she was a baby. The sound of it stopped me in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. Emily. The name was a whisper in my mind, a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. My daughter, my sweet girl, gone far too soon. She had died in a car accident when she was just 25, leaving a hole in my heart that had never truly healed. And yet, here was Mrs. Whitmore, humming that same lullaby, her voice eerily similar to Emily's. I felt the world tilt slightly, my knees trembling as I clutched the handle of the broom in my hands. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But as I stood there, watching her, the resemblance became undeniable, the way she tilted her head when she thought, the curve of her smile, even the way she brushed dirt from her hands. I forced myself to look away, to keep moving before she noticed me staring. But my mind raced with questions. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there something more to it? That night, I lay awake in my small apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling. The memories of Emily flooded back, sharp and vivid, her laughter, her stubborn determination, the way she used to wrap her arms around me when she needed comfort. Losing her had been the hardest thing I had ever faced. I had buried her, mourned her, and tried to move on. But now, for the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of hope, as terrifying as it was impossible. The next day, I tried to push the thought from my mind, focusing instead on the work at hand. But it was no use. Every time I saw Mrs. Whitmore, the resemblance struck me anew. I began to notice more details, the way she twirled her hair absent-mindedly, the faint scar on her left hand, just like the one Emily had gotten when she fell off her bike as a child. It was all too much, too strange. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to ask her. What if I was wrong? What if my questions cost me my job? The thought of losing my only source of income kept me silent, even as the questions gnawed at me. Still, I couldn't let it go. I found myself looking for clues, listening more closely when she spoke, watching her movements with an intensity that made me nervous. The more I noticed, the harder it became to deny what my heart was telling me. Could it really be her? Could my Emily still be alive? I tried to shake the thoughts from my mind, to focus on my work and leave the questions unanswered. But every time I saw Mrs. Whitmore, the memories of Emily rushed back with startling clarity. It was like seeing a ghost, though I knew she was flesh and blood. The resemblance wasn't just in her face, it was in her gestures, her expressions, the way she carried herself. It was impossible to ignore. The next few weeks were a blur of nervous energy. I found myself stealing glances at her when I thought no one was looking, listening intently to her conversations, searching for anything that might confirm, or disprove, the nagging thought in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my grief for Emily was twisting my perception. But the more I observed, the more convinced I became. One day, while tidying up her sitting room, I noticed a stack of letters on her desk. The envelopes were cream-colored, stamped with an unfamiliar address, and addressed to a name I hadn't seen before, Rose Amelia Whitmore. Rose. The name struck a chord. Emily's middle name had been Rose, a tribute to my mother, who had adored the flower. It was a small detail, but it felt significant, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. My hands trembled as I straightened the letters, careful not to disturb them. My mind raced with questions. Had Emily used a different name? Was it possible that she had survived the accident and started a new life? My heart pounded as I continued cleaning, every step feeling heavier than the last. I told myself I couldn't jump to conclusions. There had to be a logical explanation. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman I was working for wasn't a stranger. She was my daughter. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the photograph I kept on my bedside table. It was the last picture I had of Emily, a candid shot from her college graduation. She was smiling, her eyes bright with excitement, her cap tilted slightly askew. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger, my chest tightening with emotion. The woman in the photo looked so much like Mrs. Whitmore that it made my head spin. The next day, I decided to look for more clues, though I was careful not to draw attention to myself. As I dusted the shelves in the library, I scanned the books and knickknacks, searching for anything that might hint at Mrs. Whitmore's past. Most of the items were standard fare, leather-bound novels, decorative vases, framed photos of her and Mr. Whitmore at various events. But one photo caught my eye. It was a small, slightly faded picture tucked into the corner of the shelf. Mrs. Whitmore stood in front of a modest house, her arm draped over the shoulders of an older woman I didn't recognize. The house looked eerily familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. My stomach churned as I tried to push down the hope that was bubbling to the surface. Later that afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Mrs. Whitmore and a friend who had come to visit. I was polishing the banister on the staircase, my ears straining as they talked in the sitting room below. "It's just so nice to have finally settled into a routine," Mrs. Whitmore was saying, her voice carrying a note of warmth. "For so long, it felt like I was running from everything." "Running from what?" her friend asked with a chuckle. "Your life is perfect now." There was a pause, and then Mrs. Whitmore spoke again, her tone quieter. "It wasn't always. I've had to leave a lot behind. There are things I don't talk about, things that are better left in the past." My heart clenched at her words. What could she have meant by that? Was she hiding something? Was it possible that her past and mine were somehow intertwined? The uncertainty ate at me. Every day, I debated whether to confront her, to ask the questions that had been haunting me. But fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if she laughed at me, or worse, fired me for overstepping? This job was my only source of income, I couldn't afford to lose it. I resolved to keep my suspicions to myself, at least for now. But the more time I spent at the manor, the harder it became to keep my emotions in check. Every interaction with Mrs. Whitmore felt charged, every shared glance a potential revelation. I began to dread the moments when we crossed paths, my chest tightening with both hope and fear. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the upstairs hallway, Mrs. Whitmore passed by, her expression thoughtful. "Esther," she said, stopping mid-stride. "You've been with us for a few months now, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves that were prickling at my skin. "I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your work," she said with a warm smile. "You're so thorough. It's a rare quality these days." "Thank you," I murmured, my cheeks flushing with a mix of gratitude and discomfort. I couldn't help but wonder if she sensed the turmoil inside me. She nodded and continued down the hall, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. I watched her go, my heart aching with the weight of unspoken words. The days dragged on, each one filled with more questions than answers. I began to notice little things, a phrase she used that reminded me of Emily, a melody she hummed that I hadn't heard since my daughter was a child. Each detail felt like a breadcrumb leading me closer to the truth, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. Instead, I waited. I watched. And I hoped. The days at Whitmore Manor became a series of tightly wound moments, each one laced with tension. My work was the same, polishing, dusting, straightening, but my thoughts were anything but ordinary. Every glance at Mrs. Whitmore felt like a collision with the past. Each interaction left me walking a tightrope, balancing between disbelief and the gnawing certainty that she was Emily. One morning, as I was tidying the kitchen after breakfast, I overheard Mrs. Whitmore speaking to the cook, Miriam. Their voices carried through the quiet hum of the house, and though I wasn't one to eavesdrop, something about their conversation stopped me in my tracks. "I just wish I had more time to visit my old neighborhood," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice wistful. "I still think about the house sometimes." "Rosewood Lane?" Miriam asked. My hands froze on the dish I was drying. Rosewood Lane. That was where I had raised Emily, where we had built a life before everything fell apart. My chest tightened as I strained to hear more. "Yes," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice softer now. "It's been years, but I still think about it." The sound of footsteps startled me, and I quickly busied myself with the dishes, my heart pounding. Miriam passed by with a tray in her hands, and I pretended not to notice. But the name Rosewood Lane hung in the air, as heavy as a storm cloud. It couldn't be a coincidence. That night, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the photograph of Emily on my bedside table. My mind raced with memories of our time on Rosewood Lane, the long summer evenings, the sound of her laughter, the way the house always smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets my mother had made. I thought about the accident, about the police officer who had come to my door to tell me my daughter was gone. And I thought about the name on the envelope I had seen, Rose Amelia Whitmore. Could it be possible that Emily hadn't died? That she had somehow survived and started a new life? The questions circled endlessly, each one more impossible than the last. The following day, I found myself wandering into the library again, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. I remembered the photo I had seen on the shelf, the one of Mrs. Whitmore standing in front of a house. It had seemed familiar then, but I hadn't placed it. Now, I was certain it was connected to Rosewood Lane. The photo was still there, tucked neatly into the corner of the shelf. My hand shook as I picked it up, studying the background more closely. It was our house. There was no doubt about it. The peeling paint on the shutters, the narrow driveway, the garden my mother had lovingly tended, it was all there. And there, in the foreground, was Mrs. Whitmore, her arm draped casually over an older woman's shoulders. My mind raced as I tried to piece together the connection. Who was the older woman? And how had Mrs. Whitmore ended up at our house? The questions burned in my chest, but I knew there was only one way to find answers. I had to ask her. But the thought of confronting her filled me with dread. What if I was wrong? What if she thought I was prying? Worse still, what if she was Emily, and she didn't want to be found? The days dragged on, each one filled with a growing unease. I began to notice more details that connected Mrs. Whitmore to Emily, her favorite tea, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, even the faint scar on her left hand. Each observation felt like another thread weaving the tapestry of a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. One afternoon, as I was cleaning her bedroom, I noticed a jewelry box on her dresser. It was an ornate wooden box with delicate carvings, the kind that seemed too personal to touch. But something about it drew my attention. I hesitated for a moment before lifting the lid, my breath catching when I saw what was inside. There, nestled among the rings and necklaces, was a charm bracelet I recognized immediately. It was the same one I had given Emily on her 16th birthday, each charm a tiny memento of our life together, a book for her love of reading, a rose for her middle name, a tiny music note for the lullabies I used to sing. Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the bracelet, my chest tightening with a mix of joy and grief. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was Emily. It had to be. I closed the box carefully, my hands trembling, and stepped back from the dresser. My mind swirled with 1,000 thoughts, each one louder than the last. She was alive. She was here. But why hadn't she come back to me? Why had she let me believe she was gone all these years? The weight of the discovery pressed down on me, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. I told myself I needed more time, more proof, more courage. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid. Afraid of what I might learn. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of losing her all over again. Instead, I carried the secret with me, burying it beneath the routine of my days. But the questions never left, gnawing at the edges of my mind, demanding answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. The charm bracelet lingered in my thoughts, as clear and unshakable as the memory of the day I had given it to Emily. I couldn't stop picturing her face as she opened the small velvet box, her eyes lighting up with delight as she traced her fingers over the delicate charms. That moment had been one of the rare times I'd seen her so purely happy. And now, after all these years, it was in Mrs. Whitmore's possession. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that there was some logical explanation, but the pieces were fitting together too perfectly. Still, my fear held me back. What if I confronted her and shattered the delicate balance of my life? What if I was wrong, and the resemblance and clues were nothing more than tricks of my grief-stricken mind? The days at Whitmore Manor stretched long and heavy as I teetered on the edge of confrontation. Every moment I spent near Mrs. Whitmore felt charged, as though the truth were hanging in the air between us, waiting to be spoken. My nerves were frayed, my mind a constant storm of what-ifs. One afternoon, while cleaning the sitting room, I overheard her on the phone. She was speaking softly, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability I hadn't heard before. "I've been thinking about my past a lot lately," she said, her words tinged with hesitation. "There are things I haven't dealt with, things I'm not sure I'm ready to face." Her words sent a jolt through me. What could she mean by that? Was she speaking of her time on Rosewood Lane? Of something, or someone, she had left behind? I clenched the rag in my hand, my breath shallow as I listened. The conversation ended before I could glean anything more, but her words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. The idea that she might be grappling with her own unanswered questions made me feel both hopeful and terrified. If she was Emily, was she hiding her identity for a reason? Did she not want to be found? That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the photograph of Emily on my bedside table. Her bright, youthful face seemed to mock me, as if daring me to confront the truth. I clenched my fists, tears blurring my vision. I had to know. The not knowing was tearing me apart. The next day, as I dusted the grand staircase, Mrs. Whitmore passed by, her expression distracted. She glanced at me briefly, offering a small smile, but there was something in her eyes, something distant, almost sorrowful. "Esther," she said, pausing on the steps. "Do you have a moment?" My heart leapt into my throat. "Of course, ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, her hand resting lightly on the banister. "I've been meaning to thank you for all the work you've done around here. You're very meticulous. It reminds me of someone I used to know." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt my hands begin to tremble. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means a lot." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before she continued up the stairs. I watched her go, my chest tight with the weight of unspoken words. It was as though she had been on the verge of saying something more, something important, but had held back. Just like me. That evening, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront her, to ask the questions that had been gnawing at me for weeks. The fear of what I might lose was outweighed by the need to know the truth. I waited until the house had quieted down, the staff gone for the day, and Mr. Whitmore away on business. Mrs. Whitmore was in her private sitting room, a glass of wine in hand as she stared out the window. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in her expression, a heaviness that made my heart ache. I knocked softly on the doorframe, my palms damp with sweat. "Ma'am?" She turned, her brow furrowing slightly. "Esther? Is something wrong?" I stepped into the room, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I need to speak with you," I said, my voice trembling. Her expression softened, and she gestured for me to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I perched on the edge of the chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photograph of Emily, the same one that had been on my bedside table for years. I held it out to her, my hands shaking. "Do you know her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore took the photo, her brow furrowing as she studied it. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The room seemed to spin as I watched her reaction. My chest tightened, tears spilling over as I whispered, "She's my daughter. She died in an accident years ago." At least, that's what I thought. Mrs. Whitmore stared at me, her face pale. "Esther," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to say this, but I think I am your daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and shattering. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, my heart pounding in my chest. I had suspected, I had hoped, but hearing it said aloud was something else entirely. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to stay away," she said, her voice trembling. "There were things I couldn't face, things I didn't know how to explain. But I've thought about you every day." I stared at her, my mind racing to make sense of it all. The daughter I had mourned, the child I had lost, was sitting in front of me, alive and full of secrets. The truth was both a miracle and a wound, and I didn't know whether to cry or scream. The world seemed to shrink in that moment, the air in the room heavy with unspoken words. I stared at her, at Emily, my daughter, her face a mix of sorrow and vulnerability. She was here, alive, yet the years between us felt like an unbridgeable chasm. My hands trembled as I clutched the arms of the chair, my breath coming in shallow gasps. You're alive," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "I am," she said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant for it to be this way." The word Mom hit me like a physical blow, breaking through the wall of disbelief I had constructed over the years. My heart ached, a mix of joy and anguish flooding my chest. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, to demand answers all at once. But I stayed frozen, the years of grief and longing keeping me rooted to the spot. I thought you were gone, I said, my voice trembling. The accident, they told me you didn't survive. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the photo still in her hand. I know. They told you that because I told them to. Her words made my stomach churn. I leaned forward, desperate for clarity. Why, Emily? Why would you do that? Why would you let me think you were dead? Her tears spilled over as she took a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to be forever, she said, her voice breaking. After the accident, I was in a dark place, mentally, emotionally. I didn't know how to face you or anyone else. I thought it would be easier to start over, to leave everything behind. Easier? I repeated, my voice rising with a mix of anger and hurt. Easier for who? Do you know what it's been like for me, thinking I'd lost you? Mourning you every single day? She winced, her shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I hate myself for it. But at the time, I thought I was doing the right thing, for both of us. I thought I was broken, that I would only drag you down. Her words cut deep, the pain raw and unrelenting. I thought of the years I had spent alone, clinging to the memory of her, trying to make sense of a world without her in it. And all that time, she had been alive, choosing to stay away. Why now? I asked, my voice trembling. Why are you telling me this now? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. Because I can't keep hiding. Seeing you here, working in my home, it's been killing me. Every time I look at you, I see everything I've lost. I see the pain I've caused. I couldn't keep pretending. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of all the years we had lost. I searched her face, looking for the child I had raised, the daughter I had loved with all my heart. She was there, beneath the layers of elegance and poise, beneath the name and life she had built for herself. But she was also a stranger, someone I didn't fully know anymore. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I've dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it's here. I understand, she said softly. I don't expect you to forgive me, not right away. I need you to know how sorry I am. I never stopped loving you, Mom. Not for a second. Her words cracked something open inside me, the grief and anger giving way to a flood of emotions I couldn't control. I stood abruptly, my hands shaking. I need a moment, I said, my voice choked with tears. I can't. I need to think. She nodded, her own tears streaming down her face. Take all the time you need, she said, her voice trembling. I'll be here. I left the room quickly, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like a stone. My steps faltered as I made my way to the kitchen, my mind spinning with questions and emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. I leaned against the counter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers to questions I wasn't even sure how to ask. But more than anything, I wanted to hold her, to tell her I loved her, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. The memory of her as a little girl came rushing back to me, her tiny hand in mine, her laughter echoing through our home, the way she used to snuggle against me when she was scared. That little girl had been my whole world, and now she was sitting just a room away, a grown woman carrying secrets and pain I could barely comprehend. When I finally returned to the sitting room, Mrs. Whitmore, was sitting where I had left her, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice trembling. Not yet. But I do know one thing, I can't lose you again. Relief flooded her face, and she nodded, her tears spilling over once more. I don't want to lose you either, she said, her voice breaking. Slowly, hesitantly, I crossed the room and sat beside her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, tentatively, she reached for my hand, and I let her take it. It was a fragile beginning, a tentative step toward reconciliation. There was so much to unpack, so much to rebuild. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. My daughter was alive, and though the road ahead would be difficult, I wasn't ready to give up on her, or on us. The days that followed our confrontation were a blur of emotions, anger, hope, confusion, and a tentative joy I wasn't ready to trust. Emily and I had crossed a bridge that had once seemed impassable, but the distance between us still felt vast, filled with the weight of years lost and questions unanswered. The truth hung between us, raw and heavy, as we tried to navigate the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. The morning after our conversation, I arrived at the manor as usual, unsure of how to proceed. Would she speak to me? Would she avoid me? The thought of either possibility sent a nervous flutter through my chest. My work had always been my refuge, a place where I could lose myself in the rhythm of cleaning and organizing. But now, every corner of the house felt charged with the knowledge that my daughter, alive, here, was just a room or two away. I busied myself in the library, dusting the shelves and straightening the books. The quiet was comforting, a buffer against the whirlwind of emotions that had taken root in my mind. But the comfort didn't last long. Esther? Her voice broke the silence, soft but tentative. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked uncertain, her usual composure replaced by a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. Yes, ma'am? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Please don't call me that, she said, her brow furrowing. Not anymore. Call me Emily. Her words sent a pang through my heart. I had said her name so many times in my mind, whispered it in the quiet of my grief, but now that she was standing in front of me, it felt almost too heavy to say aloud. Emily, I said finally, the name tasting bittersweet on my tongue. She nodded, her eyes glistening. Can we talk? I think we need to. We sat together in the sitting room, a space that suddenly felt too grand, too formal for the conversation we were about to have. My hands fidgeted in my lap as I waited for her to speak, my nerves threatening to overwhelm me. I don't know where to start, she admitted, her voice trembling. There's so much I need to tell you, so much I need to apologize for. Then start at the beginning, I said gently, my own voice trembling. I've spent so many years not knowing. Please, tell me what happened. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. After the accident, I was in a dark place. Physically, I was fine, just a few bruises, but mentally, I was broken. I felt like I'd failed at everything, at school, at life, at being the daughter you deserved. When I woke up in the hospital, I couldn't face you. I thought you'd be better off without me. Her words cut deep, the pain in her voice a mirror of my own. How could you think that? I asked, my voice breaking. You were my world, Emily. Losing you was the hardest thing I've ever faced. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I see that now. But back then, I didn't know how to handle it. I told the doctors I didn't have any family, that I didn't want anyone contacted. And then? I just left. I started over. Changed my name, took whatever work I could find. It wasn't until I met Daniel, Mr. Whitmore, that my life began to stabilize. Her confession left me reeling. The thought of her alone, struggling to rebuild her life, filled me with both anger and sorrow. Why didn't you come back? I asked, the question that had haunted me for so long slipping from my lips. Why didn't you let me know you were alive? She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. At first, I told myself I'd come back once I was in a better place. But as time went on, it got harder. I was ashamed, afraid of what you'd think of me. And then so much time had passed, I didn't know how to explain. I thought, maybe it was better to stay gone. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. Better for who? I whispered. Not for me. I've spent 15 years mourning you, Emily. 15 years thinking I'd never see you again. I know, she said, her voice cracking. And I'm so sorry, Mom. I can't change what I did, but I want to make it right. If you'll let me. Her words hung in the air, a fragile offering of hope. I wanted to forgive her, to wrap my arms around her and pretend the years hadn't passed. But the pain of her absence was still fresh, the wound not yet healed. "I don't know if it will ever be the same," I said, my voice trembling. "But I want to try. I've missed you so much, Emily. I've prayed for this moment every day." She reached across the small table between us, her hand hesitating before resting on mine. "I've missed you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I can ever say." The rest of the day passed in a tentative haze. We talked for hours, sharing pieces of our lives that had been lost to each other. She told me about her early years after the accident, the struggles she faced and the people who had helped her along the way. I told her about my life without her, the small rituals I had created to keep her memory alive. There was still so much to say, so much to rebuild. But as I left the manor that evening, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, the weight of my grief was tempered by hope. The following days were a delicate dance, filled with cautious steps and unspoken questions. Emily and I were learning to navigate a relationship that felt both familiar and foreign. She was my daughter, the little girl I had raised, but she was also someone I didn't fully know anymore, a woman with a life, a history, and secrets I was only beginning to understand. At work, our interactions were careful, almost tentative. The formalities of our roles still lingered, her as Mrs. Whitmore, me as the cleaner, but beneath the surface, something was shifting. She began to seek me out during quiet moments, asking about my life, my memories of her childhood, even small things like my favorite books and songs. It was as though she was trying to piece together the parts of me she had missed while building a bridge back to the mother she had left behind. One afternoon, as I polished the silver in the dining room, she came in holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Take a break with me?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, glancing at the unfinished silverware. "Are you sure?" "I don't want to." "Please," she interrupted, her eyes earnest. "I'd like to talk." We sat together at the long dining table, the grandeur of the room contrasting with the intimacy of our conversation. She slid one of the mugs toward me and gave me a tentative smile. "You always liked Earl Grey, didn't you?" I nodded, touched by the small gesture. "I did." "You remembered." "I remember a lot," she said, her smile fading slightly. "Even the things I wish I could forget." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I sipped my tea, waiting for her to continue. After a moment, she looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "Do you remember the time I fell off my bike in the driveway?" she asked. "I was so mad at you for making me wear the helmet, but then I hit the curb and went flying." I laughed softly, the memory warming my chest. "You were furious. But I remember how you clung to me afterward, crying about your scraped knee. You didn't let go for hours." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "That's how it always was, wasn't it? I was stubborn and reckless, and you were always there to pick me up." "Of course I was," I said gently. "That's what mothers do." Her expression grew serious, and she looked away, her voice trembling. "And then one day, I wasn't there to pick you up. I left you to deal with everything on your own." I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "Emily, we can't change the past," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "But we're here now. That's what matters." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I want to make it right, Mom. I don't know how, but I'll do whatever it takes." Our conversation that day marked a turning point. Slowly, tentatively, we began to rebuild what had been lost. She invited me to spend more time at the manor outside of my working hours, introducing me to pieces of her life that had once been a mystery to me. I learned about her passion for art, the gallery she had once dreamed of opening, and the causes she supported with her husband's wealth. I shared stories of my own life, small moments that might have seemed insignificant but were monumental in the absence of her. I told her about the quilt I had made from her old clothes, the garden I had planted in her memory, and the friends who had helped me through the darkest days. One evening, she surprised me by asking about the accident. I think it's time I tell you everything, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, bracing myself for what was to come. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The accident wasn't as bad as it seemed, she began. I was lucky, just a few bruises and a concussion. But at the time, it felt like my whole world had shattered. I had been so lost before it happened, and waking up in that hospital, it was like a breaking point. I thought I was a failure, that I didn't deserve the love you'd always given me. So, I made a decision, a terrible, selfish decision, to walk away. Her voice broke, and she looked at me with tear-filled eyes. I thought I was sparing you the burden of dealing with me. But I see now that I was wrong. I reached out, taking her hands in mine. You were young, Emily. You made a choice that felt right to you at the time. I won't pretend it doesn't hurt, but I can forgive you. I already have. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling. I don't deserve it, she whispered. But thank you. For the first time, the weight of the years began to lift. We weren't healed, not completely, but we were on the path. And for the first time, I felt hope that we might find our way back to each other. As the weeks passed, Emily began to open up even more, sharing pieces of her life I hadn't expected. She talked about her husband, about the pressure of living up to the Whitmore name, and about the ways she had tried to find herself within the constraints of her new identity. I listened, offering support and understanding, and in return, she listened to my stories, my memories, my pain. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But it was real. And that was enough. Rebuilding a relationship after 15 years wasn't as simple as exchanging apologies and sharing stories. The path forward was fraught with moments of joy and moments of deep, aching pain. For every step closer Emily and I took, the weight of those lost years hovered between us, a reminder of what we could never truly recover. But we were trying, and that effort was enough to keep us moving forward. One afternoon, Emily invited me to have lunch with her in the garden. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the sunlight filtered gently through the trees. She had set a small table near the rose bushes, the setting far more elegant than I was used to. It's so peaceful here, I said as I sipped my tea. The kind of place I always imagined you'd thrive in. She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting across the garden. It is peaceful. But sometimes, it feels empty. Like I'm just playing a part. Her words struck me, and I set my cup down. You mean your life here? With Daniel? She nodded, her expression pensive. I built this beautiful life, but sometimes I wonder if it's really mine. Or if it's just something I created to prove I could be someone else. Her vulnerability tugged at my heart. I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. Emily, you don't have to prove anything to anyone, not to me, not to Daniel, not even to yourself. You're enough, just as you are. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I wish I'd heard that from you years ago, she said softly. Maybe things would have been different. I shook my head, my own tears threatening to spill. We can't change the past, but we can choose what we do with the time we have now. Her hand tightened around mine, and for a moment, the silence between us felt like an unspoken agreement, a promise to keep trying, no matter how difficult it might be. As we grew closer, Emily began to share more about her life with Daniel. He was a kind man, she said, but their relationship was built on a foundation of half-truths. He didn't know the full story of her past, and she had always been too afraid to tell him. What if he sees me differently, she asked one evening as we sat in her sitting room. What if he can't forgive the things I've done? Emily, I said gently, the people who truly love us accept us for who we are, the good, the bad, and everything in between. If Daniel loves you, he'll understand. But you have to give him the chance. Her eyes searched mine, uncertainty written across her face. I don't know if I'm brave enough. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You are. You've already taken the first step by telling me. The rest will come. A few days later, Emily asked if she could visit my apartment. It was a small, modest space, a world away from the grandeur of Whitmore Manor, but it was mine. I spent the morning tidying up, nervous about showing her the life I had built without her. When she arrived, she stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes scanning the room. "It's lovely," she said, her voice warm. "So, you..." I laughed softly, gesturing for her to sit on the worn couch. "It's not much, but it's home." Her gaze lingered on the photograph of her that still sat on my bedside table. She picked it up carefully, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "You kept this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," I said, sitting beside her. "It's all I had left of you." She set the photo down, tears spilling over as she turned to me. "I'm so sorry, Mom. For everything. For the years you spent thinking I was gone. For the pain I caused. I'll never be able to make up for it." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as her body shook with sobs. "You're here now," I said, my own voice breaking. "That's what matters. We can't undo the past, but we can build a future." She clung to me, her tears soaking into my sweater, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my grief begin to lift. My daughter was here, alive, and we were finally finding our way back to each other. But our reconciliation wasn't without its challenges. As Emily and I grew closer, she began to grapple with the impact our relationship would have on her life at Whitmore Manor. Daniel had noticed a change in her, a newfound emotional intensity that she struggled to explain. "I think he suspects something," she confided in me one evening. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this from him." "You shouldn't have to," I said firmly. "You deserve to live your life without secrets, Emily. And so does he." Her eyes searched mine, filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Will you be there? If I tell him everything?" "Of course," I said, taking her hand. "I'll be with you every step of the way." Her expression softened, and she nodded. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom." For the first time, the word mom didn't feel like a distant memory or a painful reminder. It felt real, tangible, a sign that we were finally moving forward. The air at Whitmore Manor felt heavier in the days leading up to Emily's decision to reveal her past to Daniel. The closer we came to the moment of truth, the more nervous she became, her usual composure replaced by a restless energy that made her pace the halls or retreat into quiet contemplation. I did my best to reassure her, but my own nerves mirrored hers. This wasn't just about her, it was about us, about everything we'd fought to rebuild. The evening of the conversation, Emily invited me to stay for dinner. It was an intimate affair, just the three of us. Daniel greeted me warmly, his charm and kindness evident as he made small talk over a beautifully prepared meal. He didn't seem to suspect the weight of what was about to unfold, but I could see the tension in Emily's posture, the way her hands fidgeted with her napkin. After dinner, she excused herself briefly, leaving Daniel and me alone in the sitting room. He poured us each a glass of wine, his tone light and conversational. "You've been such a blessing to this house, Esther," he said, raising his glass in a small toast. "Emily speaks so highly of you." His words caught me off guard, and I struggled to find a response. "That's very kind of you to say," I managed, my voice steady, despite the knot in my chest. He smiled, his eyes warm. "She seems different lately. Happier, I think. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something's changed." Before I could respond, Emily returned, her expression guarded but determined. She sat beside Daniel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and took a deep breath. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." He frowned, concern flickering across his face. "What is it, darling?" She glanced at me, her eyes seeking reassurance. I gave her a small nod, silently encouraging her to continue. "It's about my past," she said, her voice steadier now. "About who I was before I met you." The room grew still as she told him everything. She spoke of the accident, of her decision to leave her old life behind, of the years she spent rebuilding herself into the woman he knew as Rose Whitmore. Her voice trembled as she recounted the pain she had caused, the guilt she had carried, and finally, the discovery that her mother, who she had thought she would never see again, was working in their home. Daniel listened intently, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something softer, understanding, perhaps. When she finished, the silence that followed was deafening. "So, Esther is your mother," he said finally, his voice quiet. "And you never told me." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid," she said, her voice breaking. "Afraid of what you'd think of me. Afraid you wouldn't forgive me." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, I feared what he might say. But when he spoke, his tone was gentle. "Esther," he said, "is this true?" "Yes," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "Emily is my daughter." His eyes widened slightly, and then he nodded, his expression thoughtful. This is a lot to process," he admitted. "But I can see how much this has been weighing on you, Emily. And I want you to know, I'm not angry. I'm not leaving. I just need to understand." Relief flooded Emily's face, and she reached for his hand. "I'll tell you anything you want to know," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to keep secrets anymore." They talked late into the night, their conversation weaving between the past and the present, the pain of what had been lost and the hope of what could still be rebuilt. I stayed in the background, quietly observing as they worked through the layers of truth and emotion that had defined their lives. By the time they finished, the tension in the room had eased. Daniel looked at Emily with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "I'm glad you told me," he said softly. "And I'm glad you found each other again." In the days that followed, I saw a change in Emily. The weight she had carried for so long seemed lighter, her steps steadier, her laughter freer. She and Daniel began to weave me into their lives in new ways, inviting me to family meals and conversations that felt less formal and more intimate. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, a family, fractured but healing. Emily and I still had much to work through, but we were moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, as I was leaving the manor, Emily walked me to the door. The cool night air brushed against our faces, and we stood together for a moment, basking in the quiet. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For being patient with me. For giving me a chance to make things right." I smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I hadn't done since she was a child. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I'm your mother. I'll always be here for you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I love you too," I said, my own tears spilling over. "More than you'll ever know." As I walked home that night, the stars shining brightly overhead, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: we were finding our way back to each other, and that was enough. The weeks that followed felt like a gift, a chance to step into a life I had long thought lost. Emily and I continued to rebuild, not just our relationship, but our understanding of each other. The woman she had become was different from the girl I had raised, and I was different too, shaped by the years of grief and resilience. But the love between us remained, a thread that had stretched, but never truly broken. Emily began opening up in ways I hadn't expected. She shared more about her life at Whitmore Manor, her hopes and dreams, and even the struggles she had faced in finding her place in the world. I listened with an open heart, trying to piece together the years we had missed. One afternoon, as we walked through the gardens, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, my steps slowing to match hers. "Have you ever thought about leaving the cleaning job?" she asked hesitantly. "I mean, you've done so much for everyone else your whole life. Maybe it's time to do something just for you." Her words caught me off guard. I had never thought of my work as anything other than a necessity, a way to make ends meet. But the idea of stepping away, of finding something that brought me joy, stirred something deep inside me. What would I even do? I asked, my voice tinged with uncertainty. She smiled, her eyes warm. Anything you want. You're strong, capable, and you deserve to spend your time doing something that makes you happy. Her belief in me was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of change. It was a terrifying thought, but also a liberating one. As Emily and I grew closer, our bond began to reshape not just our lives, but the lives of those around us. Daniel, who had embraced the truth with grace and understanding, became a quiet but steady presence in our reconciliation. He encouraged Emily to deepen her connection with me, offering support without ever intruding. One evening, over dinner, Daniel proposed an idea that took me by surprise. "Why don't you move into the cottage on the estate?" he suggested. "It's been unused for years, and it's perfect for someone who wants a bit of peace and quiet." I looked at him, startled. "You mean, live here? On the grounds?" "Why not?" Emily chimed in, her face lighting up. "You'd be close to us, but you'd have your own space. It could be a fresh start for both of us." The idea felt too good to be true, and I hesitated, unsure if I deserved such kindness. But Emily and Daniel insisted, their excitement infectious. Before long, I found myself walking through the small, cozy cottage, imagining what it might feel like to call it home. The move brought a sense of renewal I hadn't anticipated. The cottage became a haven, a place where I could begin to rebuild my life in the shadow of the love I had rediscovered. Emily and I spent hours decorating the space, filling it with touches of warmth and familiarity. For the first time in years, I felt truly at home. One afternoon, as I was unpacking a box of books, Emily arrived with a surprise. She held out a small, framed photograph, the same one I had kept on my bedside table for years. But this time, it was accompanied by a new photo, one of her and me, taken just days earlier in the garden. "I thought they belonged together," she said softly, her eyes glistening. I took the frame, my fingers brushing against the glass. "They do," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." As the months passed, our lives began to intertwine in ways I hadn't thought possible. Emily and I started new traditions, quiet evenings spent talking by the fire, trips to the local market, even a weekly game night with Daniel. Each moment felt like a small victory, a testament to the love and determination that had brought us back together. But it wasn't just about us. Emily began reaching out to others she had left behind, reconnecting with old friends and finding ways to give back to the community that had once been her home. I watched with pride as she embraced the fullness of her life, unafraid to face the shadows of her past. One evening, as we sat together in the cottage, Emily turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd have this chance, to be here with you, to have a family again. It feels like a second chance." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It is a second chance," I said. "For both of us. And I'm not going to waste it." Neither of us would. The years ahead weren't without challenges, but they were filled with a love and resilience that carried us through. Emily and I had faced the unthinkable and come out the other side stronger, our bond unbreakable. Together, we created a new chapter, one defined not by the pain of the past, but by the hope of what was yet to come. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.